This conference will now be recorded.
March 24th, 2021. The conference is being recorded, as the little voice told us, and I will start with the roll call. Is Heather Highmark here?
I'm here.
Okay, and Andrew Lowe?
Oh, Andrew is not.
Okay, Tatiana?
Here.
And you said Christina's not, right?
Yeah.
And Alan Bingham is also, you said late, right? Not available, I mean.
Alan is available.
Yes, I'm here. Alan is
Oh,
here.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I thought she said you were facilitating. Okay, and Jahan Habib?
I'm here.
Okay, and am I missing anyone else? Okay. So then we will start. I also know we have some additional folks here tonight. And so we're going to start by introducing ourselves. Well, let's start by letting them introduce themselves. And then we can give introductions of our own selves as well. We have presenters from the Community Preservation Coalition, Stuart Saganor and Chase Mack. And
Yeah, Chase is not going to join us tonight. It's just me.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. All right. And before we get going with the presentation, I also wanted to ask the Affordable Housing Trust Fund members who are here to introduce themselves.
I'm the Housing Programs Coordinator, so I'm not sure if there's any trustees here as of right now. My name is Paul Goldstein. I just started a few weeks ago. I did forward the invite to trustees. The only person I heard back from was from David, who said he had a prior commitment but would try to be here for the first half hour or so. And I did relate that I'd be taking some notes and updating them as possible. But hopefully more will log on if they did not have prior commitments.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for joining us. And I believe we have at least one member from the Tufts UE Field team here, maybe more. And you want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, there's a few of us here tonight. This is Gabby Queenan.
Hi everyone, this is Kelsey Tustin.
Hello, my name's Amber Davis.
Okay, great, thank you. Anyone else I'm missing? Okay, and now, Stuart, did I hear Judith say you wanted CPC members to introduce ourselves to you so you can get a sense of some background on us?
Yeah, mainly just to know which boards are represented tonight, which boards appointed you, whether you're an at-large appointee or from the Historic Commission or Housing Authority. That's the main thing I was looking to find out.
Okay, fine. I'll start. I'm Laura Boretsky. I'm the chair, and I'm actually I was an appointed community rep member. Yeah, at large. Right. So I'll pass it to Tatiana.
Yes, sorry.
And just a quick introduction and your affiliation with the committee.
Yes, sorry. My name is Tatiana Shannon. I'm a community member of the committee, and yeah, my specialty, I guess, specialization or special focus here is historic preservation.
And I forgot to ask one thing. Laura and Tatiana, how long have you been on the CPC?
2+ years, 2 and a little bit for myself.
Great.
I think Tatiana said
roughly the same, I think, give or take a month. Where we came in around the same time. I'm just
right.
blanking on the exact number at the moment.
That's good.
Yeah, it was like January, February of 19. It was right around there. Yeah. Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather Highmark. I'm the vice chair of the committee, and I'm also an at-large member. I'm a landscape architect, so I bring that specialty to the group, and I'm going into my second year.
Also 2 years.
And I'll pass it to Alan.
I'm Alan Bingham. I'm in Ward 6. I'm with the Historic Preservation Commission. I'm a commissioner, have been for over 10 years. I'm currently the chair of the commission. And this is coming into I'm still in my first year with the CPA.
Great. Welcome.
Jahan?
Thank you. My name is Jahan Habib. I'm with the planning board, and I just started earlier this year, so 2021.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay, did I miss anybody?
I'd just say that the people who couldn't attend tonight, Christina Kennedy represents the Conservation Commission, and Eleanor Rancis, it represents the affordable housing, right?
Right, the Housing Authority, actually, yeah.
The Housing Authority, and yeah, they're the two that are missing.
Yeah, and Andrew.
And Andrew, right.
Andrew
And
must be
we're on the cusp of having a new committee member. Is that right?
Oh,
yeah. Great. Maybe you should introduce yourself.
Oh, that's right. This is Rose's first night.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rose White. In the process of moving into the CPC, which I'm so thrilled about.
Hopefully, the final step is Rose needs to go through the confirmation of appointments through the City Council, and then she'll hopefully be on board for next month's meeting.
great. And that'll be in an at-large position, a community position? Yeah, great.
Yeah, correct. Thanks for joining tonight, Rose.
Thanks for having me.
All right, I think that's everybody. And so with that, Stuart, if you want to take it away, go for it.
Did you want to
So,
go these other things?
Yeah, do you want to keep the group?
That's right. I'm sorry. I'm excited about the presentation. Forgive me. No, we have to first ask if there's public comments. If there's any comments from the public, I don't believe we have members of the public attending. So we can move on to approving the minutes.
I have an ongoing question related to the minutes. We had a discussion last that's reflected in the minutes, a discussion about whether or not open space receives restrictive easement, restrictive covenants or not. And Judith had followed up with me and sort of said that because it's not often given to private people to create open space, there isn't very much precedence for it. But I think even with city land, you could put a restrictive covenant on it so that they don't, say, put a building addition, right, where you just created a new playground or created a new playground 10 years, 15 years earlier. That even, it's not secured as open space just because it's city land, is my understanding. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, thank you for bringing up that question, Heather. So, and Stuart again can make a comment on this during his presentation. So, we normally receive application for open spaces on city land, like the schoolyards and also the parks that some already have a restriction on them because they have to keep open spaces in perpetuity. And then for those we acquire, like the 5 Palmer, those we normally put a restriction on them that is held by a third party. So the question that Heather is raising, which is important, is whether in the, maybe, I don't know whether it's in the agreement or the funding conditions where the CPC can request for a copy of the restrictions or whether I don't know how to handle this, because I remember during the discussion of the Central Hill Park, the same question came up, and the committee requested that they needed to submit a copy. I haven't received it yet, but it's a question that, you know, Stuart can speak to, but also can further follow up with the Department of Public Space and Urban Forestry, as well as the legal department.
And I have a good spot during the presentation that I can kind of talk about what other communities do and how this is handled too. So there's a page, I think it's called Basic Tenets of CPA, and we talk a little bit about the restrictions. And that's actually a common question of, you know, what do we do about a situation where, you know, the CPA committee has recommended $500,000 to rehabilitate a park and, you know, might be concerned about protecting that a little better than it is protected. So we can talk about that.
Okay, thank you.
Great, because I went to a ribbon cutting not too long ago and nobody there knew whether this new park was protected or not. You know, they were grateful for having received the funds, but whether or not it was going to be preserved as open space was unclear to a lot of the people involved in the project. So I think it would be great to, I look forward to your presentation and learning more about what other communities are doing.
Great. So back to your minutes, right?
Yes, back to your minute approval.
I have a couple of things that I'd like to bring up on the minutes. On page 4, where I'm talking about the presentation for historic preservation. First of all, it starts off as Mrs. Bingham. Well, I'm not Miss, I'm actually a male.
I'm sorry.
A minor point. But one that does have some significance to me. Then halfway down, we talk about the move from over 50 years to more than 75 decades. But it's not 75 decades, it's over 75 years.
Yes, okay.
That's just a factor of 10, that's all. Then 2 paragraphs further down, in the paragraph that starts off as Mrs. Tuzmaline asked about delays, and we're talking here, I think, about the 4th or 5th sentence, where I gave the example of the Somerville Hispanic Association to replace doors, and said that HPC did not approve it. It should be HPC has not approved it.
Okay.
Okay, because they didn't come before us. And I think that's the essence of the change.
I see.
Thank you.
Minor things.
Minor. Does anybody else have other edits or comments, changes to make to last month's notes? No? Okay, would somebody like to make a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll move that.
Second, somebody?
I'll second.
Thank you. Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Say aye. Yeah, say aye.
Aye.
Maybe anybody opposed? Let me put it that way, because this usually is easy. Okay. Motion passed to approve the minutes. Okay. With that, now I can hand it off to Mr. Saganor to take it away. And I am really excited to have you all back, because this was interesting, and especially with new members here.
Great. Well, I'm happy to be here, and I'm particularly excited that there's some Tufts UEP students on the presentation tonight. Are you folks, does the city have a internship program with some Tufts UEP folks? Because we've had about 1,000 Tufts UEP graduates come through our office over the years. So It's our
Wow.
favorite place to hire people from.
Yeah, so they're helping us with the second evaluation for the CPA program. So we are also very excited to have them. They're a team of 5 students. It's part of their field project, and I'm working closely with them and their professor, and they're also working with the committee.
Terrific. Well, hopefully you're finding our website useful. Actually, I'm going to show that in a couple seconds. So in any case, I'm going to do this presentation interactively. I think it works better if you folks can just chime in with questions along the way. So I'll kind of stop at the end of each section of the presentation, if that's okay with everybody, and ask if anyone has any questions, because sometimes if you save your questions to the end, it might not even make sense to you anymore what you wanted to ask. So we can certainly have time at the end to discuss as well. So next slide, Judith. Judith is running the show tonight for us. As Laura said, I'm the executive director of the Community Preservation Coalition, and our organization is a nonprofit based in Boston, but we're really just a combobulation of all the other nonprofits you see on the screen here. We have a nice cross section of historic organizations and open space and housing organizations that sit on our steering committee. We also have 8 folks who are on community preservation committees around the state who sit on our steering committee. We have some at-large folks, and we actually have 2 open slots, which we're looking for folks to sit on the committee as well, if you have any interest in being a part of the Community Preservation Coalition. So our steering committee is 21 folks in all. We meet quarterly, and they sort of set the business of the coalition and the direction we're taking, and work on our legislative issues and things like that. Next slide. So what are the things that we do? I mean, I think we're typical, for lack of a better term, of a municipal trade association, I guess. Every different department and committee in most cities and towns in Massachusetts has some type of trade association that works on technical assistance and has a website for information on it. We put out email newsletters and bulletins, which hopefully you're all on the list for. And Judith does a great job keeping us updated on your membership changes. And we'll make sure that Rose gets on the list as soon as you're sworn in. We work a lot with communities that are looking to adopt CPA. So we were extensively involved with all the folks in Somerville at the time you were adopting CPA, and it was an amazing campaign. And we have pictures of it on our website. It's one of our favorite examples of CPA adoption, and it's also the second highest yes vote of any CPA vote in the history of CPA. So it was really a terrific milestone, and we were happy to be a part of that. We also spend a lot of time up on Beacon Hill, either addressing things that communities have asked us to make changes to the law that would benefit CPA, or sometimes, unfortunately, we have to play defense and look at some legislation that someone else has filed that would not be to the benefit of the CPA community. So we work on that a ton. And we are supported in a couple of different ways. We apply for foundation grants just like any other normal nonprofit would, but the bulk of our membership comes from dues that community preservation committees pay out of their administrative funds for the suite of services that you see here. So we're very grateful to Somerville for supporting us. Without that, we're not a state agency, and we would not be able to provide all the things that we do for communities. So thank you for being a member of the coalition. We're very lucky that almost every CPA community is a member. Next slide. So I did say that I would talk about our website just briefly. It is the only thing out on the internet you're going to find statewide about CPA. You can look high and low on the state of Massachusetts website. You'll find a very small page that has some information on the CPA Trust Fund, but other than that, it's like the program doesn't exist. And that's because they consider the program to be a local program. So there's no state agency in charge of CPA. There's no anyone with CPA in their job title. There's no budget for CPA assistance. And so for better or for worse, we're it. And people often think that we are a state agency because people think of CPA as a statewide program, and it is statewide enabling legislation, but it's completely implemented locally. So that's usually a good thing when there's not, the big hand of government, hanging over your head when you're trying to do things for your own community. So this is a great website that you'll find tons of information. I don't think we've ever taken anything off this website in 20 years. So it looks pretty simple and clean, but behind those menus up at the top in green, you'll find, extensive data. And we're just about to launch within a couple weeks a really terrific new database feature where we'll have all sorts of data about the statewide CPA program that you'll be able to display in real-time reports on the website. How much, what percentage of the revenue in Wareham did they spend on recreation projects? And, really detailed questions that will be on this database we're just about to run live. So we're pretty excited about that. But for you folks, I think the biggest part of the database is on the next slide here, Judith, which is our technical assistance. And I've circled that in red there. When you hold your mouse over that tab, it opens up a big, huge menu in green there, which has tons of information that's really geared toward community preservation committees. So this section of our website, particularly the technical assistance articles in the middle, have literally hundreds of articles about the finer points of CPA. And you can usually find what you're looking for there. And if not, we are available to help you Monday through Thursday. We do technical assistance by both telephone and email, and I'll put my contact information up at the end. Next slide. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the statewide program before we talk about what you guys do in a community preservation committee and what are the role of your committee and some of the things that you have to be responsible for. CPA is in over half the communities in the state. We have 351 cities and towns, and 53% of them have CPA now at this point, and it's only in the last 20 years, so it's a pretty incredible how popular it has been. And because cities like Somerville have adopted CPA in greater numbers over the past decade or so, even though we only have 53% of the cities and towns, CPA does cover 65% of the state's population. And we're pretty proud of the fact that no community has ever adopted the program and then decided they want it out. There is a procedure to revoke CPA after you've had it for 5 years, and we have never had a community say that they weren't happy with the program. Most folks really enjoy CPA, so that's a terrific accomplishment for us. I hope I'm able to say that forever, but at some point, maybe some community will exit it. But so far, after 20 years, everyone's still on board. Next slide. This is the map of CPA communities, and we divide it now into cities in orange and towns in green. Like I said, cities have really been the latecomers to the party. CPA in the first decade was really a lot about suburban communities. The ones where land was being gobbled up for development, really rapidly around the 495 belt and on the South Shore. And those formed the backbone of the CPA program. But everyone really wanted the cities to be a part of it. So we made some changes that we advocated for 5 years to the legislature back in 2012, and they agreed to make some changes to the program that made it a lot more attractive for cities to adopt. And I think 2012 was when you folks adopted, right? I believe in November of 2012. So it was in reaction to those changes we made to the program that really made it work very much, very well for cities as well as suburban communities. So the number of communities in orange here, the cities has really exploded. And now we probably have 3/4 or maybe even a little bit more of all the cities in the state that have CPA. And we just had 3 more cities adopt this past November. So there were 9 communities that were brand new in November that were on the presidential ballot, and 3 of them were cities. So it's been a terrific to see that legislation work so well and bring more cities into the program. Next slide. So anyway, you look at CPA, whether you look at that map and see the incredible success, or if you look at what's been done with the funding, you can see the success of it. Any way you look at it. These are the data on CPA projects that have been approved through the end of last fiscal year. So it's almost a year over. We'll be updating this after June. And there's been close to 13,000 CPA projects over those 20 years. And so you can see historic preservation is clearly the most popular category because almost half the appropriations have been in the historic category. That's not necessarily true about the money. The money kind of rolls up pretty evenly among these 4 categories, believe it or not. But in terms of sheer number of projects, historic is definitely the most popular category. We've had 31,000 acres, over 31,000 acres of open space that have been preserved in some way, shape, or form with CPA, the majority through restrictions, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Outdoor recreation was the subject of a lot of those changes in 2012. The legislature really made it much easier to access CPA money for parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, and community gardens, urban agriculture. And I think back in 2012, there had only been about 500 projects in the recreation category by then. And now you can see what happened. We're now up to 2,700 projects. So if you look at the expenditures in the past 8 years, by far, recreation has been the most popular category of late. And then lastly, affordable housing. We're really happy that over 20,000 units of housing across the Commonwealth have been either created or supported in some way with CPA. So when you add it all up, believe it or not, it comes to over $2.5 billion in just 20 years between the money that's raised locally through the surcharge that your taxpayers pay in Somerville, combined with the matching money that comes from the statewide CPA trust fund, which we're going to talk about in a second. That adds up to $2.5 billion. So that's a lot of parks and playgrounds being fixed up and affordable housing units being built and historic preservation work. It's a pretty significant funding source when you get up to 186 communities. So I don't think people would realize that we have actually had that much money raised for CPA projects. Next slide. All right, so while we're talking about money, I always like to talk about the statewide CPA trust fund. And I'll stop after this slide and see if any of us have any questions to date, because this trust fund sometimes brings a lot of questions. You know, certainly the magic of CPA is this trust fund. You know, you can always go to the city council and ask them to fund a park and ask them to buy a piece of land or build affordable housing. You can always do that and use city tax revenue to do that. But a lot of times it's very difficult for those projects to compete with the basic needs like police, fire, and roads and schools. So the legislature really wanted to incentivize communities to put some money in the pot locally for these quality of life issues that CPA covers, and they incentivized it by creating a statewide CPA trust fund. And you folks and every other CPA community gets a guaranteed annual disbursement every November from the CPA trust fund. And it is a true trust fund. It's administered by the Department of Revenue. And all the money is segregated into a CPA trust fund account. And the money doesn't even come from the state budget. It comes from a special fee that the legislature created in 2000 when CPA was adopted into law, a special fee on filings at the registry. So every time someone goes to the registry of deeds anywhere in the Commonwealth and they file something that they want recorded at the registry, like a deed, a mortgage, an orders of condition from the CONSCOM, a trust document, anything they want filed, there is a fee for that. And there's a fee posting at the window that tells you how much it is. I think, let's say a mortgage to record it at the registry is $140, I think, or $125. And $50 of that fee goes directly to the CPA trust fund, collected at the window of the registry and sent to the trust fund at the Department of Revenue. Municipal lien certificates are $25, but all other documents at the registry that are subject to the fee, and most are subject, but not all, $50 will go to the CPA trust fund. And that adds up to a lot of money. Last year, there was well over $50 million, closer to $60 million that was collected at the registries for CPA. And the only thing that the law allows that money to be used for is as a match to CPA communities every November 15th. So last year, the match was the base match for all communities was 28.6%. And when we talk about these percentages, we mean 28.6% of what you raised locally. So you collect your local CPA surcharge when people pay taxes 4 times a year. They're paying a little bit of that CPA surcharge locally, and then the city adds it all up at the end of the year, and they send it into the Department of Revenue and said, we collected $1 million on our CPA local surcharge, send us our match against that from the trust fund. And so last year, the trust fund was able to pay every community 28.6% of what they raised locally. So if Somerville raised $1 million locally, you would have gotten a check for $286,000. That's true across the state. It's 28.6% of what each community raised locally. The town of Gosnold, which raises $5,000 total from CPA, got 28.6% of 5,000. You got 28.6% of about, I think, 2.5 million. I think your CPA's revenue somewhere is close to 2.5 million now. Anyone know where Gosnold is, by the way? Raise your hand if you know where Gosnold is. We got one. I'm impressed. Sometimes I go over when I ask that question. Gosnold is that chain of islands that comes off the Cape in a long string. It's called the Elizabethan Islands, I think. And the biggest island is called Cuttyhunk. Some people might have heard of Cuttyhunk. It's a big sailing destination, but that's actually a city in Massachusetts, population 50 year round, and they have CPA. And I actually got to go out there on a boat and do a training just like this for the CPA community in Gosnold, and they raised $5,000 a year from CPA. So it's really does wonders statewide, and it doesn't have to be a big program to really help what communities need to do. So last year's match was pretty darn good, and I think we're headed for another great match this year, maybe even over 30% if we cross our fingers. You know, it all depends upon what the real estate market does, right? And if you know anything about real estate, the real estate market is really hot right now. And so the revenues coming in have been really robust. In fact, the trust fund is up about $15 million year to date over the previous year. So part of that is due to that increase in the trust fund fees. That $50 is a new fee that we advocated at the legislature for 8 years, I think, to convince them to finally raise that fee. It used to be $25. It's $20. I'm sorry, it used to be $20, and the match was down really low for communities, and we finally prevailed after 8 years of lobbying and got them to raise the fee to $50, and the match is really healthy again. So we're pretty happy about where the trust fund is going, and you're in a stretch now where you're going to be receiving some really healthy matches from the trust fund for the next few years every November. So any questions yet, or any questions on the CPA trust fund? Yeah, is it Paul, I think?
Yeah, I had a brief question about the way other communities choose to disperse where the funds go. I think the CPA stipulates there's like a minimum threshold for how much you spend on each category. And I think in Somerville, it's like 50% goes to affordable housing. And I guess the question is there any sort of way to see how other communities are dispersing those funds percentage-wise?
I actually have a slide that shows the required breakdown, and then the next slide shows how you do it in Somerville. So if it's okay to defer to that slide, Paul, I'll talk about it then. But the short answer to your question is you are one of the few that puts more than the minimum requirement into each of the reserve accounts. It's very, very rare for communities to do that because, of course, when you reserve more than the minimum, which is 10% in each category, you know, you're taking away a little bit of flexibility you have in terms of the projects you fund. So we'll talk about a little bit about that on that slide. But the short answer to your question is very, very few do what you folks do. But it works for you. It works very well, as a matter of fact. So, any other questions so far? All right, so let's move on. Judith?
One quick question. So Somerville is past CPA, the second highest rate. Who's the first?
Let's see. The first highest, that's a great question, and I used to know the answer to this.
I think Cambridge?
No, it was not Cambridge. You know what? I'm going to look that up in a second on our database when we get to the end, because now I'm darn curious. But you were at 72%, I think. And I know Boston was up there in the 70s as well. So it might have been Boston. But Boston they came after you. So they came in 2016. So at the time, You were the second, so I'll find out. Sorry about that. It was a much smaller community, I'll tell you that. Something's telling me it was someone on the Cape. All right, next slide, Judith. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, and you can go right to the next slide, the Community Preservation Committee. And, we do have some new members here. I think, Alan and Johan are in their first year, and Rose is going to be in her first year very soon, and the other folks even just for 2 years. So it's good to kind of review what the Community Preservation Committee is responsible for, why you're on this board, and what sort of things you'll be working on if you are new. Next slide, Judith. All right, so by the way, Judith did send me a list of things, particularly that you folks were interested in hearing more about. So sprinkled throughout the presentation in the appropriate place, like right here, are some of the issues that Judith asked me to include in the presentation. And then some of them which were more of a discussion topic, I put at the end. So there's a slide that'll prompt us there. But Judith wanted us to talk a little bit about why CPA was made up with these 5 appointments from the other 5 boards. So as you know, CPA can have up to a 9-member committee, but 5 are required. The law stipulates that you have to have someone on the CPC from each of the 5 boards you see listed on your screen, and then there can be up to 4 at-large appointments, which you can do anything you want with. We actually have some communities that elect their 4 at-large appointees. We have 11 communities that elect their community representatives. Some of them give that one of those or 2 of those extra slots to other boards, like an agricultural committee or a housing partnership. But it's these 5 that have come from other boards that is a little bit unusual. And the reason the legislature did it that way is they realized that CPA is a restricted fund. It's not available for, a wide range of things like the general fund is in a community. And they wanted to make sure there was expertise from each of these areas on the CPC, because one of the things we'll talk about in a second is you're kind of really responsible for knowing what the needs are in the areas of open space, housing, historic preservation, and recreation in your community. And so these 5 boards really have their finger on the pulse of that. So it's good to have them on the committee to help set the priorities for the committee as to what the priorities are for the city as a whole. It's also good to have these experts on the committee because they can bring their committee's opinion to the rest of the CPC. So let's say a organization was applying to CPA to fix up a historic building in town. Well, you have a historic commission representative on your committee, and hopefully that historic commission person will go back to the full historic commission and have a discussion about that and say, hey, so-and-so historic museum applied to, do some work on their museum. How do we feel about that? Is that a priority for historic preservation in Somerville? Do we feel that the work is being done appropriately? And they can bring that advice back to the full CPT before they make their recommendation. So there's a couple of reasons why the legislature set CPA up this way. I think it was pretty clever of them. On the other hand, we can even see it in your attendance tonight. The folks that come from other boards are pretty darn busy. They already have a full plate, especially if they're on a regulatory board like the CONSCOM or the planning board. And so that can be an issue, of course. So we do tend to see that the 4 at-large folks maybe do a little more of the work. They're more of the worker bees of the committee and have a little bit more time because they're not on another town board. But by and large, the benefit is really tremendous to have this different point of view from across the different committees. So hopefully, Judith, that covered kind of what you were looking to learn in this area.
Yes, and we discussed it at our last meeting, and we actually came up with some innovations where we will now have some of these projects go before like the Historic Preservation Commission, and Alan can speak to these, the chair, so that we minimize also the delays in decision making where, we don't have to wait for them to come before the CPC, then have the representative go back to the commission and then come back to the CPC. So we are trying to find ways of, during the application process, for some of those projects that are in the local historic districts to go before the CPC, HPC, and you know, for their advice on the projects before they can submit their full proposal
Great.
to the CPC.
Yep, good idea. Terrific. All right, next slide. All right, so in terms of the basic responsibilities of a CPA committee, and I'm sure you know some of these already, but it's good for everyone to get a recap. You do have to have at least one public hearing a year, and that's designed to get input from the public on what the priorities are for the public in terms of the 4 categories of CPA. You know, typically you're not going to get, you know, probably your experience as well, you're not going to get 100,000 people in the room for this. Certainly wouldn't get anyone in the room during a pandemic, but it is good to try to promote it as much as you can. Some communities, some community preservation committees bribe folks and have a nice extensive spread of food to get people to come and give them some opinions on things. And that's certainly a very valid administrative expense if you wanted to do that. You know, it is good to get the public's input, and you are required to do that once a year at the beginning of the process or somewhere during the process. And hopefully you folks do have a community preservation plan that was written in the past. It is required when a community first joins CPA, and then every year it should, you know, receive a light edit. It doesn't have to be completely rewritten, but things do change, and you want to take a peek at it every year and have everyone read it, and then come and have a half-hour discussion, you know, or an hour with any updates that people might suggest to the plan, or new sections that might be things you want to study. Just like any board or committee, you know, you're in charge of you know, knowing what's in the piggy bank in the various CPA accounts, so you know what you have to spend. You don't have to do the actual accounting. You know, the city has folks that do that, but you should be getting regular reports from the city, you know, every month on what's been spent and what your revenues are. You know, maybe the revenues maybe only once a year, but the expenditures certainly more often than that. In the same way a department head would get reports, you know, from the finance department on the different account balances. But the main reason for your existence is these last 2 things: to prepare a budget every year to put in front of the city council, and to make recommendations on projects to the city council. And people sometimes are surprised that the CPA legislation doesn't say anything more than that in terms of how you go about making your decisions on projects. It doesn't even say you have to have applications for projects. In fact, some people think CPA was designed where the CPC would come together, study the needs of the community, and make their own recommendations. Like they wouldn't even have an application process. We've really turned CPA into an application type program in all the communities. I'm not so sure that's exactly what the legislature had in mind, believe it or not. I think they maybe would have thought of it as the CPC would actually be recommending projects themselves. But I think it works better the way we've all adapted it. But it really is up to you, that whole process of how you accept applications, what information you ask, how you debate them, what criteria you use, all those things. There is nothing in the CPA legislation about that. It starts at the point where it says the CPC shall make recommendations to the legislative body for, and then it lists all the allowable uses of CPA funds. So that's sometimes a shock to folks to find that out. But you are all powerful when it comes to deciding how you want to spend that money or make recommendations to spend that money. Next slide. All right, so this is the biggest part of the legislation is spent talking about the plan, actually. This is actually what it says about the plan. Basically, you folks are studying the needs, possibility, and resources. It uses those terms a lot in the CPA legislation of your responsibility to figure out what's important to the community. And you know, some CPCs are much more proactive than others. You know, some take this planning part of it very seriously and really feel like you know, they want to dig into the planning and really set the tone of their CPA program. and steer the applicants in a certain direction and say, you know, like, we really have, I know when Salem adopted CPA, I remember them saying they hadn't had a dime of capital spending on their park system in 12 years. They were just so strapped for funding, not a dime of capital money. So the CPC there sort of set the expectation that that's going to be a focus for us in our first, you know, half dozen years of CPA is capital projects on parks, playgrounds, and athletic fields. And they really, you know, steered the direction of the program in that direction. Other CPCs are much more reactive and feel like the community should just propose, you know, all sorts of ideas, and the CPC will sift through those for legality and for, you know, application against the plan and the priorities you've set, timeliness, ability to impact the most amount of people, and recommend a slate of projects. So again, this is all in your control. And honestly, there are 186 ways communities use their plan to set their agenda. I'll be very honest, there are some who do that plan and then put it up on an old shelf, like right behind, we see a lot of you have shelves behind you in your home offices there. There might be an old dusty CPA plan sitting there if you were in another community, and that's the last time anyone saw it, you know, and once a year they take it down, blow it off, and, you know, insert last year's projects in another little 3-hole thing on the back of it and put it back up on the shelf. And that's fine. You know, some small communities, that's all they can do. That's all the resources they have. But it's really up to you folks as to how this integrates into your program. Next slide. All right, so this, however, is not up to you. This is our discussion on what you can do with CPA funds. So as a committee, obviously, you're responsible for making those recommendations on projects, and you are making those recommendations based upon the priorities that you've uncovered through your planning process. But you're also kind of responsible for making sure that the projects are legal according to CPA as well. And a lot of times you have to bring in your lawyer to do that, but some of them, you know, should be pretty obvious if you really understand the law, but it's not so easy to understand. So, you know, I said we have a technical assistance line at the office. 90% of our questions are about, you know, is this a legal project, you know, or how do we go about this project? Something about what we call allowable uses. And the allowable uses for CPA are in one paragraph. The entire 17-page law only has one paragraph on what you can spend the money on. It's section 5B2, and it is a long paragraph that is so difficult to read. It says something like, you can spend money on the acquisition, creation, and preservation of open space, on the rehabilitation of open space if it was acquired with CPA funds, on the acquisition, preservation, and rehabilitation of historic resources. And it just goes on. And you read that paragraph and you're like, I have no idea what we can do with this program. And then about 15 years ago, we were kind of 5 years into, you know, feeling our way around in the dark, and DOR came out with this allowable uses chart, and it was like this light bulb went off in all our heads, like, you know, okay, this is starting to be a little bit easier. This is starting to make a little bit more sense to have a chart like this to explain what you can do with CPA funds. And everyone knows the categories, right? We all know the 4 categories of CPA. That's pretty obvious. And people are not going to come to you with an application to pave a road. They know, you know, it's for open space, historic, recreation, and housing. But what most folks don't know is those verbs along the left-hand side, those verbs have to describe each project. And you have to find a box on this chart to put the project in order to be able to fund it. So if you can't find a box on this chart that describes a piece of a project or the entire project, it is not eligible for funding. And sometimes you have to dig down into the actual budget. You know, you get a project to rehabilitate, you know, a historic building. Well, you know, that certainly looks like it's allowable, right? Historic category, rehabilitation, there's a big yes down there, right? But everything that's involved in that project may not be fundable. Sometimes you really have to dig into the actual budget and go line item by line item to figure out what box it applies to. So this can be very useful. A lot of communities, you know, have this, if they meet in the same room at City Hall all the time, they have this chart up on the wall behind them so they can look at it during the meetings, or they plunk it down in the middle of the table. But it is really helpful to look at the allowable uses chart on your very first stop. When you're on a CPC, you know, when you're grocery shopping at Market Basket, someone's probably going to come up to you at some point and say, hey, you're on the CPA committee. Can we fund blank, 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 blank? And, you know, I always tell folks, you know, to, you know, pull out the chart to answer that question, because it does really help. So any questions on this chart? You want me to talk a little bit more about how to read it, what the verbs, what the definition of the verbs are? They all have definitions in section 2, all those words on the left-hand side. Any questions?
Stuart, would you mind expanding a little bit on what support means under housing?
Excellent question. All right. Well, first I'll answer the obvious question. Why is support only in the housing category, right? You notice it's a dash, 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 you know, no, no, no for open space, historic, and recreation. So the legislature knew that housing was going to be the toughest category. I mean, it is not easy to build housing. It's expensive. It's politically charged. We don't have a lot of land in Massachusetts. You know, we have, you know, Somerville is, you know, the Uber example of not having a lot of land. Are you still the densest city in New England? But, you know, by and large, land is not, you know, readily available anywhere in Massachusetts. And it's politically charged. It's just hard to build housing. It's a lot of red tape. So they wanted to give as many tools as possible to CPA communities so they could get some success in this category. So you'll notice, you know, the housing category has more yeses or partial yeses than any other category of CPA. And that's by design to help communities along in this task. But when CPA first came out, there was no definition in section 2, like there was for acquire and preserve and rehabilitate. There was no definition for the word support. And so that, you know, led to a lot of gnashing of teeth. You know, one community would say, I want to do a rental assistance program, and their town attorney would say, yes, I consider that to be a support of affordable housing. And another town attorney said, no, I don't consider that to be a support of affordable housing. So one of the changes in 2012, there were about 17 changes that year, was to come up with a definition of support. And it was done mostly to get at that problem I just described, which was some communities wanted to do rental assistance and they were getting a no from their town council. And that kind of horrified all the housing advocates in the state because they clearly felt that CPA and rental assistance was one of the things that were okay. So there is a definition for that term. It mostly talks about the types of rental assistance or direct assistance to home buyers, but it also says support, you know, shall mean this, but not be limited to this. So it still has a pretty wide basket. So some of the typical things you'll see in the support category of support of affordable housing are funding affordable housing plans, funding feasibility studies on different parcels to whether they could handle housing, funding a housing coordinator for the community if they don't have one already, funding grants to other organizations that create housing, you know, giving funds to the housing authority if there's someone who builds housing. So there's a lot of different things you can do in support, and it is fairly wide open. You know, if it's in support of affordable housing, technically it'll meet that definition. Support also has to fulfill all the other rules of CPA too. So in a different part of the law, it says CPA can't be used for maintenance or operating expenses. So that would apply here. You know, support is broad, but it can't include maintenance or operating expenses because those things are not allowed elsewhere in the law. So it does give you some flexibility, and communities do use it differently. It is the box where all the rental assistance programs are justified by, because you're not acquiring a housing unit or land for housing by doing rental assistance. You're not, you know, creating a housing unit with nails and wood. You're not preserving, meaning protecting a housing unit from industry harm or destruction, and you're not rehabilitating a housing unit. You are supporting affordable housing in Somerville by having a rental assistance program. So that is the box that justifies that expenditure. And that's the best I can give you. Yeah, go ahead. I see a hand raised.
Can I?
Oh, it's Rose. Yeah, hi, Rose.
Jump in there. Hi.
I'm getting some names with the faces, but not all of you yet.
Sure. I'm wondering, do you, is it common for any of these, for CPC's decisions about determinations about allocations based on this box to be challenged, or does that not really happen?
It's not very common. You know, usually the reason why is some things are just so obvious, you know, when you look at this chart. But what they're not so obvious, you know, what CPCs, you know, what we encourage CPCs to do, and most do, is to just kick the question to their city solicitor or town council. So the reason why you don't see a challenge that often is if something is questionable, it usually gets asked of someone in the legal staff ahead of time. In smaller communities, you know, sometimes the lawyers don't have a good background in CPA, and so DOR will issue legal opinions as well, but not very easily. They're very understaffed. I think there's 6 lawyers for 351 municipalities, so it can be difficult. You know, typically with other programs around the state, there'd be a state agency that would have a legal staff that could help you. You know, if you have questions on, you know, environmental pollution, there's definitely people at the EPA, you know, in Massachusetts that will answer the phone and answer questions. If you have questions on procurement, there's the Attorney General's office. If you have questions on historic preservation, there's the Mass Historic Commission. There isn't one for CPA, as we discussed. So usually town council or city solicitor is where you'll go for those controversial ones or those questions. And we answer a lot of these questions too, but we're not attorneys as well. So, you know, we know the law pretty darn well, and we do get calls from, I always laugh when we get calls from municipal attorneys, because they probably think we're attorneys, but we're not. But we do know the law pretty well, so we can also help as well. But, you know, occasionally you do have to really dig in with your lawyer. Anyone else with the chart?
It's a
Stuart,
question. Go ahead, Judith.
Oh yeah, so I was going to ask, we've also been struggling with some applications. So in the past, we've received an application that has a historic and affordable housing component, but the affordable housing is also existing. So and these are housing like vulnerable communities. So we have always said yes, of course, after consultation with the legal, the city legal council, we always give them advice that we can the rehabilitation or restoration of the historic component, the exterior, is okay, but then we cannot support the interior because the affordable housing unit was not created using CPA funds. Then on the other hand, on the other hand, there's a project of ours, I think you know about it, the Mystic Waterworks project, which was formerly a water pump station that was converted into affordable housing. It's also both historic and affordable. So sometimes references are kind of made between the two, but I know that for the Mystic Waterworks, these affordable units were created. But then for the other one, they are existing, but then they're also in need of rehabilitation. So what advice would you give?
So I followed you right up till the very end. So the Mystic Waterworks, so you had two combination historic housing projects, right?
We've had several of them, actually. We've had several, not just, we've had a number of them. Broadway House is another one. So we have a number of these instances.
Right. So the first part I followed, Judith, where the one that was an existing affordable housing units that needed work in a historic building. The exterior, can be done under the historic piece according to the Secretary of Interior standards, but really hard to do anything on the interior there because those are existing affordable units, and there's no public historic benefits to the inside of a unit. So that I think you handled perfectly. The Waterworks one, that was a historic building where you were building affordable units from the beginning, right? So,
Yes.
so nothing wrong with pretty much that entire project. Almost everything in that building, except for maybe buying the refrigerators, you could justify with CPA funds because you were constructing affordable housing units and you were doing historic preservation at the same time. But I missed you right at the end. You've faded into a different category of question, and I didn't get that.
No, I think you answered my question.
Okay, all right, yeah. So for the Mystic Waterworks, it's totally different because that is a building that didn't have existing affordable housing in it. So that box down the corner there in the bottom right-hand corner is one that brings the biggest questions. That you can't rehabilitate an existing affordable housing unit unless it was acquired or created with CPA funds. And that was deliberate. The legislature did not want CPA to be a program that fixed up existing housing units. They wanted to be a program that addresses the fact that we have a severe shortage in Massachusetts of housing units, both affordable and market rate, frankly. There is a huge need for fixing up existing affordable housing units. Housing authority properties are really old and in many cases very dilapidated. But CPA is a pretty modest funding source. They can't do everything, right? And so the legislature really wanted to keep CPA focused on creating new affordable opportunities, new rental assistance programs, new units, and things that didn't exist before. But occasionally we get tripped up in this category because there is such a huge need on rehabilitation of existing units. So there are some limited things you can do there. It gets kind of complicated to handle in a presentation like this, but it is an issue that comes up over and over again, and it is a little easier to deal with when you have the historic category involved as well. Alan, did that?
I had a question that goes back to your needs, possibility, and resources slide.
Yeah.
You're talking about the definition of the planning process, where you include even regional resources.
Yeah. So
does that mean that the Green Line extension, for example, coming through Somerville, we don't have much open space, but we do have a Green Line extension coming through. Does that mean that say enhancing bike paths or the planting of the public corridors, the pedestrian corridors along that extension would be eligible for CPA funds, Somerville CPA funds?
Maybe, but that's not what we're talking about here by regional projects. So I'll answer the question in two parts. Why is this regional projects in here first? That was actually one of the changes in 2012, believe it or not, that consideration, that phrase, including the consideration of regional projects or community preservation, did not exist in the first CPA legislation from 2000. And it actually came out of Newton. Newton was the Newton League of Women Voters actually pushed this issue of and asked for this to be included in there. Because, in Massachusetts, we have 351 individual little fiefdoms. We're very parochial. We've got our all little cities and towns, and every single one of them has a planning board, and every single one of them has their fire station, their own fire station, and their own DPW garage. And it is not the most efficient way to run government, with 351 little individual communities like that. The rest of the country doesn't do it that way, but New England, we do. There are cases of where, doing something on a regional basis rather than just a city or town or going it alone makes a lot more sense. And so the state really helps facilitate a lot of regional stuff and gives extra funding to libraries like the Hamilton, Wenham, those two towns got together and have one library right in the middle. And there's some benefits to getting state funding when you do things regionally. And so that was the idea behind that change. The project you were asking about, the Green Line project, I don't see that as the regional issue at all, because you're talking about something happening on the ground in Somerville. The regional projects would be towns getting together to fund something that might be in one town or another, or crossing the line. But that project would really just be considered under the recreation category. And the problem is that folks get confused in the recreation category of the land where they're doing the work. So CPA recreational spending should, for the most part, there are exceptions, but for the most part, be on land that is dedicated to recreation. So, it's not for, planters along the sidewalks, right? It's not for bike racks in front of City Hall. That's a recreational type thing, but with CPA, it's all about the land. It's all about, it doesn't actually say recreation in the act. It says land for recreational use. That's actually the category. Recreation is just a shorthand term. And by the way, this chart is the shorthand version of the chart. There's actually a much more extensive version on our website, which is the actual one that DOR did with definitions for all these words on it. So the recreation category is actually all about land for recreational use. So to the extent that, a bike path is a dedicated land for recreational use and it's under control of the Parks Department, and perhaps maybe it's even covered by Article 97, which is the state's protection for recreational land, or perhaps it had a conservation restriction on it, or perhaps it's just been used that way for many, many years and is clearly a recreational resource. Then you might be able to do the plantings and the benches and the bike racks, for example, and the lights. But if it's not clear that it is dedicated land for recreational use, then you shouldn't be spending CPA money on it in most cases.
I think it's state land and not city land.
Right. So same issue. You wouldn't want to be putting money into that because the state might do something different with it in the future, right? There's probably no formal protection on that land unless it's in a state park or something like that, or on DCR land. So you really have to dig into the land. You have to look at the land and what restrictions are on it and whether it is dedicated for recreational use before you spend CPA money on it. Now, there are exceptions, like school playgrounds are usually on school property, and you're not going to get around that. It's not going to be under control of the Parks and Recs Department. But it's very rare for a playground in a school to be eliminated. But you really need to look at the land before you decide before you look at what you're going to be doing on that land, you have to look at the status of the land and make sure it's dedicated recreational land. Then you can look at what you're going to spend the money on and see if that's okay. Does that make sense? I see some nodding heads and some not. So if you have follow-up questions, we can discuss that some more too at the end if you want. All right,
Yeah,
so where were we?
Sorry, I think I'm experiencing some technical problem. My computer froze. I don't know if you experienced it. It has never happened before, so in case it gets off, we will have to re-log in. Sorry about that.
You know what? What if we tried? Are you totally frozen, Judith? Because I have a copy of this presentation on my computer. We could try giving me control to screen share and I could take over doing the presentation. I'm not as familiar with GoToMeeting as I am with Zoom, but I could give it a shot. But are you not even able to do that?
I can share with you. I just froze for about like 30 seconds. I didn't hear the last things you're saying. I was just worried. I thought everyone is frozen. But
No,
yeah, I think we can proceed.
Okay, can you advance the slides? Is it frozen or you can advance the slides?
I think I can.
Yeah, okay, good. Was this the next slide, Judith? I don't know if what the last slide was. Was the chart was the last slide? Yeah, okay, good. All right. So one of the things Judith asked me to talk a little bit about was, how the CPC interacts with the city, because the CPA is just another city board, but it really is very unique, and in many cases much more independent and has a lot more responsibility and control than other city boards. Yeah, that's good, Judith. Hit the slide once and then hit it again too. So go to the next slide. And then hit your space bar once. This is a cutesy little animation here. So there you go. Okay, good. Hang there and I'll tell you when to hit the other arrow. So one of the things about CPA in terms of the way the legislature intended it to be, you have your regular city budget that Somerville has had for 200 years or however old the city is, through taxation and through state aid and a lot of other funding sources. And CPA was always designed to be a surcharge on top of that. So it's not for the things that are in the regular city budget. As a matter of fact, there's a section of CPA in section 6, the supplanting section, that talks about the fact that if something's in the city budget or the city regularly pays for something, you can't then move that expense over to CPA. That was not the idea of CPA. CPA was not designed to give 101.5%, revenue to the city. It was designed that the city keeps their regular budget and does what they do, and CPA is an additional 1.5% surcharge on your taxes for new initiatives, new affordable units. That's why you can't take care of the existing affordable units that you already have. That needs to come under the regular city budget. You already had that asset. CPA is for new assets, new housing, new parks, new playgrounds, and that sort of thing. You can hit that slide again one more time, Judith. There you go. And so the best illustration of this is kind of a tops down, bottom up type approach. The regular city budget is really a top down affair. There's not much an ordinary citizen of Somerville can do to really have a true impact on the city budget. It's the city councilors, the city staff, the city finance department, and the regular city departments that really all come up with that budget, and it flows down into projects. CPA is designed to be the exact opposite. It is a community fund. That's why it's called the Community Preservation Fund. And it's community based. It was passed by a voluntary vote in your town where people voluntarily voted to increase their taxes. So it's designed to be a bottoms-up approach, a grassroots approach to budgeting and planning and prioritizing things, as opposed to a top-down approach. So that's kind of the, the best way to really sum up the difference between a city budget and the CPA budget. And the communities that really get this, like Somerville, who really understand this, have amazing CPA programs and do amazing projects and have tremendous support among the public for their CPA program. The communities that try to take the green CPA money and as much as they can, integrate it into their regular city budget and put it under the regular control of the city staff and the city council and the mayor, and try to put things in there to free up other money in the city budget. Those are the ones where we constantly see battles and gnashing of teeth and just CPA programs that aren't very successful. So kudos to you folks for kind of understanding this concept and really making your community fund all about the community's priorities in a very grassroots approach. Next slide, Judith. So for those of you who are new, you remember I talked about the fact that there is no, formal process outlined in the legislation for how projects happen, but in general, most communities have, followed this type of approach where people submit applications to the CPC. Your most important role is to really dig into those projects and review them and get input from the public and from other city boards and committees. And to really vet those proposals, make sure they're legal, and see if you can actually even put value added, see if you can work with the applicant to even make them better, and then when you're finally done, you make your recommendation to the city council, and then every expenditure of CPA money requires a majority vote of the city council to spend that money, to actually appropriate that money. Certain projects are 2/3. If you're taking property by eminent domain, if you're paying for a CPA project with a bond, or if you're, in most cases, buying something, buying some type of land or buying an apartment building to use for housing, that usually requires a 2/3 vote too at the city council. But the most of CPA projects are majority votes at the council. Next slide. All right, so once the council gets the recommendations from the CPC, their role is, their options are a little bit more limited than the regular city budget. They can approve your recommendation, they can reject it, or they can approve it, but with a reduced amount. They can also order the money sent to the applicable reserve account, but that just really almost never happens. So that's sort of a budgeting, to keep you out of budget trouble. So it's not even worth really talking about that. But you know, they can't spend any CPA money on their own. They can't initiate any projects. They can't completely change your recommendation into something that it wasn't supposed to be, because then it's not your recommendation anymore. So they are a little bit more limited than they are in general appropriations that they make. Next slide. All right, and I mentioned bonding briefly, and we actually have an entire presentation just on bonding. So if you ever wanted to talk about that, we can, although you folks are pretty experienced in that, I think. But it is possible, I just mentioned it for the new folks, that it is possible that some CPA projects can be paid for with bonds, and you're basically borrowing against the future CPA revenue stream in the same way the city borrows against its future tax revenue stream to build a you know, a new school or to buy a fire truck. You can bond against your 1.5% CPA revenue stream. As I mentioned, it does ratchet up the approval you need at the city council to a 2/3 vote. And you can only pay the debt service on bonds that were issued under CPA. If the city has a bond that it's had for 10 years and has 10 more years to pay with it, and they think, oh, gee, maybe, you know, that was a bond for a historic rehab. Maybe we can have CPA help us pay the debt service in year 11. We're a little tight this year. That can't be done. It has to be a project that was originally approved by the CPC to be bonded under Chapter 44B, which is the CPA legislation. Next slide. All right, so this is my my basic tenets slide, kind of the five big things about CPA that are kind of rock beds to the program, and one of them is about restrictions. So this is the time we're going to talk about that question on restrictions, and we're getting toward the end here. So thank you for sticking with us. So some basic tenets of CPA that are kind of the real important ones to know for the program. We already talked about the fact that you can't supplant general municipal revenue. So, you know, if the city is always paid for something, or the council has already authorized money for a project, or it's already in the budget, you can't then later switch that funding source to CPA. You also can never spend on maintenance or operating expenses, with the exception of that 5% that can operate your committee, you know, that pays you the salary and pays your dues to our organization. Thank you very much. But besides that little 5% on operating the committee and your expenses, no maintenance or operating expenses can come out of CPA for projects. The recreation category, sometimes folks miss this. I just got a question today about, you know, spending CPA money on a basketball gymnasium, but CPA is for outdoor recreation projects only, land for recreational use. And the definition of land for recreational use is actually part of the definition of open space in CPA. So it's clear that the legislature was talking about land in, as they describe it, as close as possible to its natural state. And that's why you can't spend CPA on any structures that are very large in the recreation category. Certainly no buildings where recreation is happening inside. Another real important thing at CPA is this restriction piece. So CPA only requires a permanent preservation or historic restriction or a conservation restriction. They only require that when you buy something. So if the city buys a piece of land that they're going to use for a park, or a playground or an athletic field or conservation land. You wouldn't see that too much in Somerville probably. But if the city's going to buy a piece of land, there must be a permanent restriction put on that land held by someone other than the city that's going to keep that land protected forever. So if you buy an apartment building to use for affordable housing, there has to be an affordable housing restriction approved by the state on those affordable housing units. You buy a piece of land and you're going to use it for a park, there has to be a conservation restriction on that park approved by the State Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. You buy a historic property, and that has to be a historic preservation restriction approved by Mass Historic Commission. That's the only time a restriction, is required under CPA. Now, we get to the situation that I think you were asking about. I think it was Heather who asked this, right? What happens when CPA is giving a pot of money to do some rehabilitation work on a resource that the city already owns? So the city owns a piece of land, and they're going to build a park on there, and they've owned that land forever. And the CPC is being asked to put $1 million into building a park on that land or fixing up an existing park that's dilapidated. The law does not require a restriction on that parcel because you're not buying it, you're just fixing it up with CPA funds. But some community preservation committees, depending upon the situation, may make that a condition of their project. We had one situation, was actually a historic building, where a community had a historic building that was not used. It was just a surplus historic building in town. And they received, the selectmen had talked a lot about selling that building over the years. Still nothing ever happened. They never sold it, and it's still unused. And then the selectmen decided they wanted to apply to the CPA to fix up the building because it was in tough shape. And the CPC said, well, wait a minute, not that we don't trust you, but you've talked about selling this building for 10 years now. Are you just going to fix it up with CPA money and then have it in great shape and then sell it? And town's going to put the money in its coffers? We're not interested in that. So what the CPC did is they gave them the money, but they also required that a restriction be put on that building so that if it did get sold, the restriction was permanent. So the historic preservation restriction would go with the new owner of the building. So in that case, it wasn't required that there be a restriction on that building. You were just fixing it up with CPA money. You weren't buying it. The city already owned it. But the CPC felt there was a reason that they would condition the project upon a restriction being put on the building. And that could apply to a piece of land too. If you have a piece of land that is not permanently protected as recreation land, you may, not be comfortable putting CPA money into it unless a conservation restriction was put on that land. It might not be enough to just have it under control of the Parks and Recs Department or covered by Article 97, which is the state's protection for recreation land. You might want, for whatever reason, to require it to have a restriction to put on it. So that is up to the CPC to do that. It's not all that common on city-owned land, but it can happen, and there are situations where it would make sense. So Heather, does that answer your question? It does. Okay, good. And then the last basic tenet of CPA, did anyone else have a question on restrictions with regard to that? Okay, good. The last basic tenet, I think you probably all know, is that we talked about this, that the CPC must always make a recommendation on an expenditure before the city council can vote on it. So it takes two things, a CPC recommendation and a city council vote to spend any CPA money. Next slide. Okay, so this is the last section of the presentation. I do have a section where we can see some examples of other CPA projects in other communities, but I think probably we're not going to get to that tonight unless you all want to want to extend the meeting, but you've been so good, and I know Zoom is a lot more tiring than being in meetings in person. So we can stop after this section and see if what you want to do about the last piece of sample projects. Next slide, Judith. All right, so just for the new folks, particularly a little budget overview with CPA. You know, one of your jobs you saw before is to present an annual budget to the city council, and that's usually done at the same time all the city departments are presenting their annual budgets to the council. It does require you to vote on your annual budget recommendation. So once it's all put together, usually by Judith and the financial staff, and they put it in front of you folks, you know, the CPC does have to make a motion to recommend that to the city council. And when you craft your budget, you're basing it on the revenue you expect to receive in the coming year from CPA. And CPA has two revenue sources every year, right? You have money you bring in from your local CPA surcharge, that 1.5% on everyone's tax bill, and you get a trust fund distribution every November. So the total amount of money that you expect to receive in a given year is those two things added together. And from that total, you construct your budget. And next slide. So what does a budget look like? Well, CPA requires that of that 100% of your revenue that you expect to have, you must spend or set aside in a reserve account 10% for each of the three categories of CPA. 10% for housing, 10% for historic, and open space and recreation share a reserve account. And open space would be conservation land, which you probably don't deal with too much in Somerville. Recreation would be parks, playgrounds, athletic fields, more active recreation. Those types of projects can both come out of the open space and recreation reserve account. So every year you have to spend, that's the only requirement on spending in CPA. That's all it says, is you at least have to spend or reserve for later spending 10% on each of these three categories. At your option, you can set aside up to 5% of your annual revenue for administrative costs. That's the yellow box. And that would be expenses of running your committee. One thing about the administrative account, it is not an administrative account for the CPA program in Somerville. It is an administrative account for the operation of the Community Preservation Committee. There's a big difference there. It's for your use as a committee in running your committee and paying Judith's salary, paying someone to take minutes, you know, paying for that food at your public hearing, paying for an ad in the newspaper, which is required for the public hearing, that sort of thing. You know, flyers and brochures and copying that you might do as a committee. You cannot pay for other CPA related expenses that the city incurs. So, you know, the assessor spends money putting out the assessments on the 1.5%, and the tax collector spends time in their day to collect that 1.5% surcharge. And the town clerk might spend, you know, time processing all the CPA application that going to the city council. You know, there are a lot of things that different city departments do that are related to CPA, but this administrative fund is not designed to pay for those departments. They have to absorb that into their regular business, just like they absorb everything else, things they do for the city. The administrative account is for you folks to use for your committee, not for the general CPA program. Hopefully that makes sense. And then the balance in the blue, you know, you can do anything you want with. Now, these are the minimums. This is the way CPA says in the law, but they're minimums, these 10%. And most communities set it up this way. But if you go to the next slide, you can see there are some exceptions, and you guys are one of those exceptions where you have decided up front, you're not going to just spend or reserve 10% for housing every year. You're going to do 50% because if you've uncovered that as a priority in your community, and you're going to spend 15% or reserve it for historic and 20% for open space. And then 10%, you know, you're going to put in an account where you can use it for any types of those projects. Like I said, there are a couple communities that does this. I think Bourne spends 80% for open space every year. 80% would be just about the max, or 75% if you're going to have an administrative budget. Cambridge every year spends 80% on housing. They always have. I can only think of maybe 1 or 2 other examples. So maybe there are 4 or 5 communities in the state, you among them, that do more guaranteed minimums in these categories than the law requires, and that's terrific. I mean, it's all about tailoring the program to what your community needs, and you know, it's to answer whoever asked this question earlier, it's not all that common, but it's certainly possible. Did that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, so does that mean most other communities, they put the funds in the budget reserve category and disperse as they so choose?
Exactly. Yep. And you know, those communities tend not to be really as good at planning. You know, Somerville is really good at planning, you know, and looking at the big picture and you know, and really thinking about the revenues you have and holistically and looking to the future. You know, you guys kind of set the bar for that, honestly. You know, it's not that way in every one of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. I live in a little town on the North Shore. We don't have a planning department. We don't have a planning director. We have a planning board, but they're all volunteers. You know, we have no paid planning staff. So, you know, we don't really know enough that, you know, we should be spending 50% on housing, you know, or we don't have the resources to even make that happen. So we're kind of, you know, those CPCs are just kind of reactive. You know, they're looking at whatever applications they come in and they're trying to match that with their priorities, but they're not really thinking holistically about the program and steering the program in that direction because they just don't have the staff or the planning or the expertise to do that. So kudos to you guys. Next slide. All right. Oh, there was one more section. Sorry about that. Judith did ask me to talk about what is involved if a community ever wants to increase your CPA surcharge. And we have had, I think, 11 communities that have taken their CPA surcharge up a notch when they felt it was necessary for upcoming projects. Next slide. So the process to do that is you have a maximum. You can go up to 3%. You guys are at 1.5% currently. 1.5% happens to be the sweet spot. You know, communities that try to adopt CPA at 1.5% have a much higher success ratio for some reason than communities that try at 1% or 2% or 3%. 1.5 is like, it's like the Goldilocks. You know, it's half of 3%. It's not too much. It's not too little. It's just right. So the success ratio of people trying CPA at 1.5% is something like 85% success ratio on elections at 1.5%, and it's down closer to 60% for any other surcharge level. We do have the largest number of communities at 3%, but that's because when CPA was first launched back in 2000, it was a different economic time. And we had a lot of suburban, more wealthy communities adopting CPA, and about 70 of them right at the beginning came out of the gate with 3%. We haven't seen more than, I think, 2 or 3 communities adopt at 3% in the last decade. So the 3% really was a surcharge for a different time, but you know, some communities have been able to get 3%, but not many lately. It's just a different economic time. So next slide. So if you did want to increase your surcharge to go to 2, 2.5, or 3, you go back through the process again. You know, the city council has to vote to put a question on the ballot to ask the voters to approve that, or advocates can go out into the city and collect the signatures of 5% of the registered voters. And in that case, you would bypass the city council. If you collected 5% of the registered voters, that question would go right to the ballot. And we have had communities do that in the past. That's the way Quincy adopted CPA, was through gathering signatures every Saturday all summer long outside Stop and Shop. So step 1 is to get the question on the ballot. One of these 2 methods has to be used. And then next slide, Judith, step 2 is a ballot election, just like you had in 2012 at the next regularly scheduled election, either a local election or a state election or a presidential ballot. And then the voters weigh in on whether they want to increase their surcharge. So the last slide we have on this, which is next, we kind of put together some numbers for you, just in case there might be some interest in the future in doing this in Somerville. The top column Actually, it would be a row, right? Columns are up and down, rows are across. Is that right? Someone give me the symbol there. Row across. Okay. So the top row is what you have currently. Your 1.5% current surcharge brings in about close to $2.2 million in local revenue, going up every year. Last year, you received $616,000 in your state match, and that was the 28.6. Now, it's a little difficult to estimate in the future what you would receive or bring in at 2% or 3%. But if we pretend that you had 2% last November or you had 3% last November, we can kind of get an estimate. So if you had 2% when you got your November 2020 distribution, if it had been based on a 2% surcharge, you would have raised closer to $2.9 million locally, and you would have gotten an $821,000 match. That 28.6% of 2.8 million is 821. And at 3%, you would have raised about $4.3 million locally and gotten a $1.3 million match, basically. Now, you notice that the percentage goes up a little bit on the 3% match. See that 29.9%? There are 3 rounds of funding in the trust fund distribution. Every November, this DOR goes through 3 rounds of funding. Round 1 gives everyone the same amount, 28.6% last year of their local revenues. If you have adopted CPA at the full 3%, those 70 communities who adopted CPA at the full 3%, they go on and get funding in rounds 2 and 3 of the trust fund. There's a lot, it's a formula, it's complicated, but there's a lot less money available in rounds 2 and 3. The vast majority of the money, 80%, goes out on round 1. But there is a little bit of money available on rounds 2 and 3 extra for communities that adopted at 3%. So that's why your final matching percentages would be a little higher if you went to 3%. Any questions on that? All right, so next slide.
Sorry, Stuart. Yeah, I just wanted to give information to the committee that in 2019, the previous committee had started a discussion on increasing the surcharge. And I think it was supposed to be considered last year, but because of COVID, this conversation was put on hold. So I thought it would be important for members, in case in future they want to, again, revise the conversation, that they know the process.
Yep. Any questions on that process or how it'll work? Or all right. So I think at this point we should pause, and I should turn back to the chair to determine how you want to proceed. This last section of the presentation is I just sort of run through in rapid fashion, some of the other ways CPA communities have used funds, some of the more interesting or unique projects. But I do realize that it is 8:10 and you've been on Zoom for an hour and 40 minutes, and you all have lives, and maybe there's a Celtics or Bruins game on that you want to go to. So I'll turn it back to the chair to see how you want to proceed.
Actually, if I may just ask one quick question, because I was muted. In towns where they try to, I'm wondering if you've seen in towns that where they've tried to raise the percentage if there was much pushback from residents. Like you said 1.5 was the sweet spot. That makes me think that it would be maybe not the best idea to raise it. I'm just curious to hear more.
I'm not going to lie to you. It would be a little bit of a lift, I think. Yeah. Because it's not the same go-go era that it was, back in the early 2000s when a lot of those communities adopted 3%. So most of the communities that have asked for an increase have received it. I think it's only been rejected a few times. But usually there has to be a trigger, right? You're probably not going to be very successful if you're just saying, well, CPA is great, we want to do more projects, so we need more money. Usually the communities that have raised it had some particular reason. They had a beautiful town hall that was going to cost $3 million to fix up, and there was never any money going to be any money available in the regular budget to do that. It had been put off for years, and that was the only way they were going to accomplish it is if they could raise their CPA surcharge and devote most of that money to that project. Or another community, realizes they, have, so many people are just in uproar about the dilapidated condition of all the fields in town, or all the parks in town. And they really want to invest in that, and they're getting a lot of complaints about that. So there usually is a compelling reason to do it. And we've, a couple communities that have voted to raise their surcharge just to do a particular project, that was important to the community. But just a general increase, it might be hard. On the other hand, you've had such great success with your program. I think you probably have a lot of goodwill built up on CPA. People really get it in Somerville, and they see the great things you've done. So you never know, but it does help to have a compelling need.
Okay, thank you. Because I know we don't have a whole lot left on this agenda, I'm going to say, why don't you take 5 minutes, because I also, like you said, want to be mindful of, it's been a while and it's a Zoom meeting. Why don't you take 5 minutes or less to tell us about some of the most popular projects?
Okay, we'll zoom through them real quick. And then if anyone else has other questions too. I realize that not everyone has the same CPA geekiness that I do. I mean, I could stay online all night with you folks and just have the greatest time talking about CPA, but I realize you're all volunteers. I get paid for it. But I do happen to think it's a really cool program, and some of the things that have been done in other communities are really neat. So, so Judith, I'm going to give you like a quick next slide, and we'll roll through these real quick. You ready to go? All right. So go for it. Next slide. So this goes by categories. We start with the historic preservation category, and by far the most popular use of CPA historic money is to fix up municipally owned historic buildings. Talked about communities that have done very large projects. In the bottom right corner, that cupola is on the largest ever CPA project, which was a top to bottom rehab of Needham Town Hall. It's $15 million. Still to this day, 10 years later, the largest ever CPA project. And the other one on this slide that I'd like to point out is that a tower on the top left, that is Gloucester City Hall. The whole reason they adopted CPA in Gloucester was to fix up that building. It is a beautiful, iconic city hall. It's at the top of a hill. It was built so that when the fishing boats come back into the harbor and they make that final turn into the harbor in Gloucester, they look up, they see City Hall, their home. So it's just a masterful building and a masterful siting, and it was in terrible shape. If the wind blew over 40 knots, they had to evacuate the building because that thing was going to fall over. And they passed CPA specifically to rehab that building. Next slide. Another popular use is what we talked about, right? Adaptive reuse of buildings like the waterworks, or this old shoe factory in Middleborough in the top right corner, or in the bottom left corner, an old small library in Cohasset that is now 2 affordable housing units. Those people at that groundbreaking are in Chelmsford at an old town hall that was surplus, they don't use anymore, and now it's this really amazing art center right in the center of Chelmsford, operated by a nonprofit in their old city hall. Next building. Next building, next slide. And then also you do a lot of this too, grants to nonprofit community groups that have terrific buildings that are always, really accessible to the public. The bottom right corner is the Abigail Adams birthplace in Weymouth. That building was in such bad shape, there was graffiti all over Abigail Adams birthhouse in Quincy, operated by the Abigail Adams Society for the past 250 years or more. Now it's beautiful, as you can look at that. The Academy of Music is, if you've ever been to Northampton, it's an iconic performance space right on the main drag there. You can't go into downtown without seeing that facade of that building, and that facade was completely restored, including the sign with CPA funds. And the top left is really cool. That is in Westfield. That is the last remaining whip factory in Westfield. Westfield is called the Whip City because at one point there were 9 whip factories, and I mean horse and buggy whips. in Westfield. And that's the last one, and they're turning it into a museum of Whip City history in Westfield. So a really cool project. Next slide. In CPA in 2006 was amended to allow documents and artifacts to be rehabilitated as well as buildings. We've had a ton of amazing historic documents discovered in libraries and basements and things like that that have been restored with CPA money. And this category is all about doing the actual restoration work to the document. It's not a funding source for digitization or research or interpretation. You know, CPA is about fixing physical things in general. And so this is about fixing up, you know, moldy documents that are found that are, you know, really significant to your community. Next slide. All right, moving on to the open space category. Playgrounds, you know, huge in probably your community and CPA, but it doesn't stop just at regular playgrounds. You know, we could, you know, talk about skateboard parks, splash parks. I mean, it's incredible the variety of projects that have been done. Lately, it seems like everyone's building a pickleball court. If you look through the CPA database, you're going to see pickleball courts all over the state. And 2 years ago, no one even knew what pickleball was. Maybe there are some people on this. Anyone not know what pickleball is? Don't be embarrassed. Yeah, see, people haven't heard it. It's like a mini game of tennis. It's tennis and squash outdoors, kind of mashed together on a smaller court. It's very popular among senior citizens because they don't have to run as far, you know, and so they can play pickleball. And it's really social, and it is just the hottest thing across the Commonwealth. And so we've built like 100 pickleball courts with CPA funds. You will get a pickleball application, I guarantee you, at some point in the next few years. Next slide. Athletic fields, obviously a big, huge part of CPA. The bottom right photo, I love that photo because that's the chair of the CPC in Bridgewater. And she was on a mission to build a softball field for the girls because they didn't have their own softball field. They played at the boys' softball field, but they got the lousy dates. You know, they got the 8 p.m. games when they were eaten alive by mosquitoes, you know, after the boys played. And she didn't think that was fair. And it's not. And so she made an admission of herself to get her CPC to agree and the town to build a beautiful softball field for the girls. Now the boys have to ask if they want to play there, and maybe they'll get a date. So kudos to Marilee Hunt, the CPC chair there down there, for doing that project. Next slide. We've had a ton of rail trails. Someone brought up this with CPA funds. Converted to CPA, you can buy the land with CPA funds. You can build the rail trails with CPA funds and add amenities, you know, like benches and things like that. Next slide. Parks are obviously a big section of CPA, but sometimes you don't realize that you can create parks and open space by taking something down. And certainly in urban environments, particularly Cambridge does this a lot. They create parks by taking out buildings. So the top right is the one I'll point out to you. That's in Weymouth, that little pocket park there. That's right along the Herring River, and where those blue railings are is where they stand and count the herring that come up the river every year. They do their annual herring count on that spot. But that spot was a dilapidated garage at one point, and they used CPA funds to rip down the garage and then build this park. And as long as you're going to have open space after the fact, you can use CPA funds to tear down the building and remediate the property too, and then build the park. Next slide. So something to remember for a dense community. Community gardens is actually in the definition of recreation in CPA, so a really popular use. This one's a little more difficult because a lot of the community gardens need annual operating expenses. You know, they need water, and maintenance and things like that, which CPA can't pay for, but certainly the infrastructure to build it or the land to buy it, to buy the land for the community gardens is certainly an eligible CPA expense. Next slide. All right, moving on to affordable housing. With CPA, there are a lot of rules on affordable housing in general, but CPA has their own too. CPA is for people who earn up to 100% of area median income. Most affordable housing programs will only go up to 80%. but CPA can go up to 100%. Next slide. So how we use CPA funds. We have a lot of communities that use CPA funds for specialty housing, like housing for veterans. Next slide. Another use is to fix up existing buildings and convert them into housing. So we saw that kind of in the historic category. Now it's coming back around in the housing category. The one I love the best is the bottom left corner. That's in North Andover. This was an abandoned nursing home right in downtown North Andover. Perfect building to convert to affordable housing when the nursing home closed. Next slide. We've had a lot of communities use it for really specialized things in addition to that veterans housing. But this is a tremendous project in Lexington, and then Rockport did the same thing, where this building it serves 9 people who have traumatic brain injuries who are low income. And they completely rehabbed this building. It did happen to be a historic printing shop, believe it or not, and a tremendously successful project that was replicated by the same nonprofit. It's a nonprofit called Supportive Living Incorporated that runs these houses and provides services. Next slide. We've had a lot of communities partner with Habitat for Humanity in building CPA housing. They're, the most cost-efficient builder of affordable housing in the world because they use so much donated labor and donated materials. And communities a lot of times get involved with their local or regional technical high school. So those guys on the porch in the bottom left in Lincoln, Massachusetts, came from the local technical high school. And as part of their semester-long project, they helped build this unit of affordable housing in Lincoln. Next slide. All right, so that's all the projects I had. Judith did identify a couple other things that we were going to talk about if we had time. I think we have run out of time, certainly run out of your patience. So we'll table those for next year's visit, Judith, or we can talk about those by phone or email discussion at some point in the future. So happy to answer any other questions that you have, and I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much. Any other questions for Stuart?
Hi, Stuart. I have a question. This is Jahan here. First of all, thank you so much for the excellent presentation. It was very useful and helpful. So besides pickleball courts, are you seeing other trends that you might want to highlight with respect to the requests that are coming in with many of the communities across the Commonwealth?
In the recreation category, particularly, you mean?
No, just in general. Well, an open question.
I don't think I can. I mean, one of the things I love about CPA and the way it was structured is it is so individualized in terms of what your needs of your community is. In Plymouth, their program is all about historic preservation. I mean, they spend so much money. Their goal is to get every building in town under a historic preservation restriction, and in Cambridge, obviously, it's all about housing. So we don't see big trends like that because communities are really creative in the way they use the program locally. I think, one of the things that always is a big part of CPA, and it was really the reason why CPA was invented, was to protect land from development, to make sure that we have enough open land. And Massachusetts is a pretty built up state. And the pandemic, I think, has really shown people that, holy cow, we need our parks and playgrounds and athletic fields. And, we need our outdoor public spaces. And there's been a real renaissance in interest in parks, especially in urban areas and built environments. So that has certainly been a trend. And I'll be honest with you, we had 9 new communities on the ballot to adopt CPA in November. And I thought this could be possibly the first year where we went 0 for 9, where not one community on the ballot would pass because, people are hurting in the pandemic. It's not the greatest time to be asking for a tax increase. And, the guts of those advocates in those 9 communities to put it on the ballot. But it went the opposite. All 9 passed. And it wasn't even close. Like they were, they weren't 74% like you were. Or 72%, but they were pretty high. There was none of them that were close. And what everyone realized was it was the focus on the parks and the open space and the playgrounds and, you know, the unbelievable amount of usage that these assets have gotten over the past year. Bike trails have been packed, you know, almost to the point where you can't social distance in the parks because so many people want to be there. But it has been really exciting to see that part of CPA, and, you know, all these hundreds of playgrounds and parks that communities have built with CPA funds and all that 30,000 acres of open space that they purchased over the past 20 years, you know, where people might have been ho-hum before. Yeah, CPA, it's kind of frivolous, you know, it's parks and buying open space, you know. I think people are realizing now, you know, how terrific it is to have a funding source for those sort of things. So, you know, certainly as an urban community like yours, you know, where you see opportunities to possibly squeeze in little pocket parks or neighborhood parks by taking down dilapidated buildings or reconfiguring lots, that's definitely something we're seeing across the state, and I think that's going to be really accelerated by the pandemic.
Thank you very much.
Okay, if there are no other questions, I'm going to say that we move on to the other business listed on the agenda.
Yep. And Laura, while you're doing that, I'm just going to look up what that other community was that beat you in terms of success ratio, because I'm dying to remember myself. So just before you adjourn, just come back to me and I'll let you know what it is. I'll look it up now.
Okay. Judith.
Yes, so thank you. So I just wanted to remind the members that next meeting will be a public hearing for the community preservation plan. And then for members that have not yet submitted their conflict of interest law education certificates, please do. I think the deadline is beginning of April. Yeah, those are the two really things that I wanted to share, but to also thank Stuart very much for this, you know, wonderful presentation and the training. We all feel refreshed and we look forward to having you again.
Okay.
No, happy to do it.
Do you have the answer to your question yet?
I do. Our database is really cool. Kudos to Chase. You met Chase last year. Those of you who were around last year, Chase is our communications director and our database and research person. And all right, so the highest success ratio ever was actually a community last year. So this wasn't the case when you adopted in 2012, but West Stockbridge adopted. There were 10 communities that adopted CPA in 2020. The 9 on the presidential ballot, but West Stockbridge voted in the spring, also during the pandemic, and they had a 79% yes vote on CPA, and it was in May, so it was really, you know, in the grips of the pandemic, May of 2020. So that power of parks and open space. And then the community that beat you, you guys were at 76%. I couldn't remember if it was 72 or 74 or 76, but you were at 76%, and Wenham was at 77% about 15 years ago. So you're in third place. We set aside the communities on the Cape because they had a special form of CPA where they converted their Cape Cod land bank into CPA back in 2005, and that was like a pro forma vote. So those yes ratios were all ridiculously high, but it was really more of a pro forma vote. So of the initial adoptions, it now goes West Stockbridge at 79% yes, Wenham at 77, and you guys have dropped to third place with 76%.
Okay. Well, thank you for that wonky review. You are the wonk, the CPA wonk.
I'm usually the only one interested in things like that, so I love that someone asked that question.
Okay, Judith, is that all the business then? All the extra business?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so the next meeting that's a public hearing, as Judith said, is on April 28th, 6:30, and Zoom held. Does somebody want to make a motion to adjourn?
This is Heather. I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Thank you.
I'll second that.
All right. Then it is 8:32 on March 24th, and I will call the meeting adjourned officially.
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.